Ladies and gentlemen, the moment we have all been waiting for is finally here. Ray tracing is the biggest visual change to gaming since dynamic lighting, and you'll be able to enjoy it in resolutions of 1440p and even 4K, thanks to Nvidia's newest flagship, the RTX 2080 Ti. So Nvidia made some big promises with ray tracing and upscaling in the last generation of Turing GPUs. But today's the day those dreams finally become a reality for gamers. Introducing the RTX 3090, more than twice as fast as the 2080 Ti in both rasterization and ray tracing performance. And it's about to take the gaming world by storm. So it turns out that while Nvidia had a huge vision for the future of gaming with Turing and Ampere-based GPUs, I think it's pretty obvious that the tech, and more importantly the performance, just wasn't up to snuff for that vision to become a reality yet. Does that change with Nvidia's newest flagship, the RTX 4090? We're about to find. If all of that sounded familiar, it's because we've heard most of this song and dance before. 4K gaming, revolutionary visuals, mind-bending performance. And while the previous generation GPUs absolutely delivered on performance over their predecessors, it felt like the realization of Nvidia's promise of real-time ray tracing, that is, fully dynamic lighting, realistic reflections, light scattering, and realistic light sources, were always just out of reach in terms of performance. And that's kind of why I'm so impressed with Nvidia's latest flagship GPU in the RTX 5090. See, it's actually the smallest leap in performance that we've seen in quite a few generations, owing most of its 30-ish% performance increase to equal bumps in CUDA cores, RT and Tensor Cores, memory bandwidth, as well as a 30% higher power ceiling. It's the least next-gen card we've seen since Nvidia's Kepler 2.0. But that's not the whole story. See, while performance may be a little bit of a letdown for some when talking strictly about rasterization and ray tracing, it's the other tech that has received most of the attention under the hood. While the 30% performance bump isn't the best we've ever seen, it's still significant on its own. But paired with Nvidia's DLSS 4.0 upscaler, and paired again with their latest generation frame generation, I dare say that this might be a watershed moment for both gaming performance and for gaming visuals. So then, starting things off, the RTX 5090 is just straight up stupid. It's a flagship GPU, and priced at $2,000 US, it's not exactly an impulse purchase. It's twice as expensive as the upcoming RTX 5080, and while that card is expected to have literally half of the raw performance, it's also going to come in with the same impressive tech under the hood. It's not unrealistic that you could build a full gaming desktop with an RTX 5080, a motherboard, CPU, memory, NVMe storage, power supply, case, and wind up spending only a couple $100 more than having a 5090 sitting on your desk. The 5090 is stupid for basically everyone. It's the supercar of the GPU world. But damn if it's not impressive. Not only is the 5090 itself expensive, what you'll need to also run it is dramatically more expensive than other PCs. This is a 575 watt GPU, and in my testing, even during gaming, it reached 579 watts. That means you need an equally performant power supply, probably at least 1,000 watts at minimum, and a 12 volt high power outlet that can supply 600 watts of power. I'd actually recommend a 1200 watt platinum rated or better power supply to make sure all your bases are covered. And that's likely going to run you between $250 and $350 on its own just for the power supply. And if you're planning on gaming at 1440p, you're also definitely going to need a Ryzen 9000 X3D CPU. The fastest GPU in the world is going to require the fastest gaming CPU on the market, especially at 1440p and possibly even at 4K in certain games. Add it all up and you'll easily be north of $3,500 for even the most basic RTX 5090 build. $4,000 plus is also very realistic with higher end motherboards, CPU coolers, a nicer case and fans, and the like. Now, I may be a tech enthusiast, but even I don't have $2,000 sitting around for a GPU right now. Thanks to Nvidia for sending this card over, by the way, before release for this review. I've been working with it for close to a week now, including nearly a full 24 hours worth of benchmarking, and I definitely have some thoughts, both on the 5090 itself and the direction of gaming as a whole. So, let's dive in. For my testing today, I only tested the RTX 5090 against two other graphics cards, the RTX 3090 and the RTX 4080 Super. I would have liked to include the RTX 4090 or the 7900 XTX from Nvidia, but I don't have either one of those on hand. My review is going to be centered around the AI claims like improved RTX performance as well as frame generation, so I wanted examples from the previous 2-generation RTX cards. If you want full comparisons, I'd recommend checking out eTechnic's review, which I will link down in the video description. The test bench for today should be no surprise. We're running a Ryzen 9800X3D, which is the fastest gaming CPU currently available, along with 32GB of G.Skill Trident Z 6000 megatransfer DDR5 memory, all running on an Asus Corsair X870E motherboard. For power supply, I'm running Cooler Master's 1100-watt tiny little SFX power supply. Not an SFXL, a true SFX 1100-watt with a 600-watt 12-volt high power output. It's a pretty baller little unit. Let's get some of the overall performance numbers out of the way first. This was a very lengthy process, as basically any new GPU review tends to be, and obviously I'm posting this a couple days after the embargo date. As I said, I'm actually less concerned with overall performance numbers compared to the last generation, and more interested in the direction of gaming, game development, visuals, and how the increased use of AI is going to impact the games that we play. That was obviously the focus for Nvidia this time around, and I wanted to see what impact that focus actually has today and what it might mean for the near future. Focusing mainly on the performance improvements over the RTX 3090, let's take a look at some synthetics in 3D Mark, starting with DirectX 11 in Firestrike Ultra. Here, the 3090 manages a graphics score of 12,656, while the 5090 more than doubles it up with a score of 30,745, or around 2.4 times faster over the 2-generation-old flagship. DirectX 12 in TimeSpy Extreme shows nearly identical results, this time 10,020 to 23,533, or an improvement of 2.3x. While we're more than 4 years removed from the launch of the RTX 3090, it's still impressive to see a 2.4x improvement just in straight-up rasterized rendering. As remember, neither of these tests utilize ray tracing or any AI upscaling. This is all old-school rendering performance. Speaking of ray tracing, I was actually a bit surprised to see similar performance gains when RTX is added to the mix, especially without DLSS or any other assistance, which some might refer to as cheating. In Port Royal, the RTX 3090 notches a score of 13,321, but the RTX 5090 keeps up the pace, coming in at 2.4x faster with a score of 32,226. It's again a similar story in DirectX 12 Ultimate with 3D Mark Speedway. Even the RTX 3090, when new, struggled to render this test at a frame rate faster than most movie cameras, resulting in an absolutely cinematic score of 5,492. No extra credit for guessing that the RTX 5090 again rounded out at about 2.4 times faster, coming in with a score of 12,941. If there's one thing I love when testing out new hardware, it's completely linear and consistent data. 4 different synthetic tests, both traditional rendering and ray traced, with nearly identical results across the board. I'm starting to think the 5090 might be the fastest consumer GPU that's ever been made. When it comes to gaming, I'm again not going to focus on every single test result, as this is the 9th review you've probably seen at this point. I'm likely just going to deliver similar numbers to everyone else. Again, I want to focus on a couple individual games and scenarios that I think will be most impactful moving forward. Comparing the 3090 to the 5090 also isn't a straight apples-to-apples comparison though, as the RTX 5090 has support for DLSS 4 and Nvidia FrameGen, where through AI processing, the game will guess how the next series of frames should look, while it waits for the card to finish actually rendering the next frame. On Nvidia 4000 series GPUs, you could essentially double your frame rate, with every other frame being AI generated. On 5000 series cards, you can now generate up to 3 frames for every real frame, which we'll get into shortly. That said, I ran a 7-game suite with a variety of settings, comprised of some of the most demanding titles on the market today. Cyberpunk 2077, Doom Eternal, Dragon Age Veilguard, Metro Exodus, Red Dead Redemption 2, Starfield, and Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. Comparing apples to apples with the RTX 3090 means only looking at rasterization, ray tracing, and DLSS performance, leaving FrameGen out of the equation entirely. In that circumstance, I see the RTX 5090 at around 75% faster on average at 1440p, with an even wider gap of 115% when moving up to 4K. I did ask Andy over at eTechnics if I could compare my data alongside his, as they have a much more comprehensive list of GPUs, along with an RTX 4090 for those wanting to see that comparison in this video. In native rasterization, without ray tracing at 1440p, they show an average performance improvement of just 5% over the 4090 and at around 25% at 4K. It is important to note that at 1440p, we're talking about frame rates of 269 FPS on the 4090 and 283 frames per second on the 5090. We may very well be looking at CPU bottlenecks or even game engine limitations, as some of the raw architecture calculations that I've done previously show CUDA performance could be as much as 40 to 55% higher on the RTX 5090. The real world often doesn't care about theoretical performance though, as every game presents its own variables that may slow down performance. Enabling ray tracing does help widen the gap at 1440p, showing upwards of 21% improvement over the 4090, but 4K results are nearly identical with a 28% uplift. And again, thanks to Andy for allowing me to share his results over here. And again, link down to eTechnic's full results will be down in the video description. Make sure to go give him some love. So, like I mentioned earlier, at 4K, we're seeing plus or minus just around 30% of total improvement in performance over the RTX 4090, from a GPU that has a 33% increase in CUDA cores, RT cores, as well as a 33% higher TDP. Is this the next-gen card that everyone was expecting? I'd argue that, yes, actually it is. Performance leaps always ebb and flow, and over the last 5 years, we've seen arguably the largest leaps in performance on both CPUs and GPUs that the tech industry has ever gone through. And I say this as someone who vividly remembers the original gigahertz race leading up to the year 2000. Not every generation is going to set the previous one on fire, and 30% is still nothing to scoff at, even if the efficiency to get there has essentially flatlined. But that leads me to my larger point in this review, and that's taking a step back to look at the evolution we've seen in visuals since Nvidia promised us full ray tracing all the way back in 2018. Nvidia released a GPU in the 2080 Ti that, like the RTX 5090, was only around 30% faster than the 1080 Ti it was replacing. It was more expensive, it required more power, and Nvidia promised that the new and improved visuals would change the way you play games forever. Sound familiar? At the launch of the 2080 Ti, there were some impressive tech demos, like the real-time Captain Phasma clip. There were also literally 0 games supporting real-time ray tracing available at launch. And when those games did start to trickle out over the next 18 months, it was pretty obvious the road to Nvidia's promise was going to be much longer than originally planned. RTX features came out slowly, with many early titles opting to implement only individual features, like RTX Reflections in Call of Duty Modern Warfare or Watch Dogs Legion. And honestly, while early RTX features were pretty to look at in still frames when not playing the game, because we weren't talking full ray tracing yet, it just wasn't worth the performance hit to enable any of the eye candy. The first title with most of the RTX features actually added in a game was Control, which launched in 2019. And it struggled to hit 35 frames per second on the 2080 Ti even at 1080p when all the new ray-traced goodies were enabled. It was also a similar story when Cyberpunk 2077 launched in late 2020, with even the RTX 3090 struggling to hit 40 FPS in RTX Ultra presets at 1440p. In both of those games, though, there was another key feature made available in DLSS, or Deep Learning Supersampling. Essentially, it's a real-time supersampler lowering the rendered resolution of a scene, then upsampling it to a higher resolution. And while frame rates in Control and Cyberpunk didn't dramatically increase with it activated, the first generation of DLSS wasn't exactly known for its visual quality, often leading to a wide array of visual artifacts, and for me, was often bad enough to disable entirely and just lower my settings to improve performance instead. To say the launch of RTX-style features has been rocky would be quite the understatement. Despite the potential with ray tracing, gamers really didn't see any definitive visual improvements in games for multiple years after the launch of the 2080 Ti, and those that were pretty enough to make a difference visually were still horribly slow at their highest settings. But, especially over the last couple years, I've seen a noticeable bump in visual quality and performance in a wide variety of games that implement ray tracing features. Cyberpunk is one that, with each new update, got better and better with its implementation of ray tracing. Visuals are night and day compared to early builds of the game. A major reason for that has actually been improvements made to DLSS, where today the majority of visual artifacting has either been reduced to the point of not mattering or eliminated altogether. In my testing this week, the RTX 3090 can now run not only RTX Ultra presets in Cyberpunk, but RTX Overdrive with full path trace lighting. With DLSS 3, we get an average of 50 frames per second and a 0.1% low of just 40. While it's still slightly sluggish for such a fast-paced game, it's totally playable and honestly breathtaking when you stop and look at all the different lighting effects put together in the streets of Night City. It's one of the prettiest games that's ever been made. But we're not here to talk about the RTX 3090. What about the RTX 5090, and what kinds of visual improvements are actually on display with the latest flagship GPU? Well, sticking with Cyberpunk 2077, at 1440p, the 5090 manages an average of 71 frames per second with a 0.1% low of only 49 at the RTX Overdrive preset. And that's without even enabling DLSS. That's pure, raw, rasterized 3D objects with real-time path trace lighting and reflections. And it's absolutely gorgeous. With DLSS 4 enabled, mind you, this beta version of Cyberpunk is one of the only titles to support DLSS 4 at launch, we see those scores jump up to 121 frames per second on average with a 0.1% low of 69. Nice doesn't even cut it here. As someone who has spent literal days of my life testing Cyberpunk and searching for visual artifacts of ray tracing or DLSS, the game has never looked this good. Now, I know some people out there are going to look at a scene like this and ask, why do we even need ray tracing? I had no problems playing Cyberpunk without ray tracing or path tracing, and I think it looks just fine the way it is. It's a valid question. Is the potential improvement to lighting, reflections, and overall visual quality and immersion worth the squeeze that it places on your GPU? To that, I would say the only way technology moves forward is when you push it. And now that we have the RTX 5090 and enough power to properly drive Nvidia's original vision for ray-traced graphics, we're going to start seeing more and more titles with better and better lighting effects, which can lead to both better games and better overall experiences. And this isn't just me blowing smoke up Nvidia's ass. I was as skeptical as anyone if RTX was ready for its debut. But having grown up in the era of seeing the first 3D rendered enemies in Descent and Turok, the first dynamic lighting effects in a game in Thief the Dark Project, some of the first rendered shadows in King's Quest Mask of Eternity and Metal Gear Solid 2, effects we certainly take for granted today, but truly did change the way games were made and what games looked like on screen. Another game I've been absolutely gobsmacked by is Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, one of the first titles to outright require a graphics card capable of real-time ray tracing support. Even at its lowest settings, it requires some type of RT acceleration for the lighting in-game to function. And the results at supreme settings look pretty good. Reflections off glass look natural, individual light sources provide their own little touches to the overall scene. That's what I thought, until I enabled full path tracing. In Indiana Jones and Cyberpunk alike, rather than just simulating reflections and light travel with ray tracing, path tracing seeks to simulate how light interacts with different objects in a scene. Different properties can be applied in a game engine, and objects will react to light and reflections similarly to how they would in real life. But probably the biggest difference between the two modes, besides the performance requirements, is just how freaking good the shadows became. In Indiana Jones, the difference is downright shocking, with supreme settings, which is full ray traced enabled, still leaving blocky, imprecise shadows on the ground, with pixelated edges that jitter around with the slightest movement of an object or a light source. Full path trace shadows block and reflect light in a much more realistic way, softening the edges of shadows depending on the distance you are from the light source or the area in which you're casting a shadow. Light bounces off glass, creating visuals that previously had to be programmed by hand to occur. Instead of focusing on individual effects for specific objects, a game designer can now simply model an object and give it the properties of glass or stone or carpet or wood, and the lighting engine handles the actual interaction of light and shadow with those objects. The result is shockingly good-looking visuals, and with the increase in performance on the RTX 5090, actually playable today at both 1440p and even at 4K. But it's also not perfect yet. See, I'm quite used to hunting for graphic artifacts and glitches these days when testing out new GPUs. Between Nvidia's DLSS, AMD's FSR, and Intel's XeSS, each of them often have slightly different quirks and affect visual quality in different ways. Sometimes it's little things like slight shimmering effects around moving objects, or a fan winding up with too many blades. Other times it's more dramatic and immersion-breaking issues, like poorly rendered objects and faces, to lighting issues or flashes of color, or halos around your character, moire effects on certain textures, or even straight-up missing textures and effects. But one thing I haven't seen talked about much at all is graphical anomalies of ray tracing itself. See, while full path tracing is the future of game rendering, we're also still very much cheating when it comes to replicating lighting and 3D objects. Traditional rasterization is where a GPU takes 3D polygons from your game engine and then renders them onto a 2D flat plane in a 2D image that can then be displayed on your monitor. True ray tracing, and by that I mean true path tracing, is actually a rendering system that relies entirely on replicated light to convert 3D geometry into an image that can be projected onto your monitor. Ray tracing as we know it today is still a hybrid rendering process, where we're still starting with 3D objects and then projecting rays from the camera's perspective into the scene to approximate the travel of light. It's a two-step process, and now that path tracing is fast enough to run in reality instead of just in theory, both Cyberpunk and Indiana Jones show some elements that could use some improvements. For starters, both games show a decent amount of lag when it comes to glare or reflections on surfaces. And I'm not talking about true reflective surfaces like a mirror or glass, but rather a sunbeam bouncing off of the concrete on the street or off the wood floor in the museum. When looking at a reflection, either towards or away from a light source, and then moving perpendicularly to it, the reflection lags a bit behind your camera. And if I had to guess, it's because the ray tracing that's happening in the scene is being processed separately from the 3D render. As such, when your camera moves, it has to reproject the light, and that light is drawn onto the scene. But then it has to update the position of your camera, which means the light that's being projected is always slightly behind the current position of your camera. If that makes sense. When you start moving in Indiana Jones, there's around 3 frames of delay in-game where the reflection stays in place after you've moved. And then once it starts moving, it kind of ghosts behind you, and the floor and the reflections seem to update accurately. When you stop moving, there's between another 3 and 5 frames where the reflection catches up and then settles in its new position. This is at 4K with full path tracing, but DLSS and FrameGen completely disabled, so this is an artifact strictly of the path traced lighting, not of AI upscaling. In Cyberpunk at 4K, again at RTX Overdrive preset with path tracing, with both DLSS and FrameGen disabled, we see it's closer to 6 frames of delay between the start of your character moving and the reflection updating its location on the pavement. Another graphical artifact that I noticed in Cyberpunk was I noticed a delay in how shadows are handled with an NPC's feet. Follow me here. When an NPC is walking, while their feet are in contact with the sidewalk, there's obviously no light source illuminating the underside of their feet, so the game renders it as dark. However, when they lift their feet off the pavement, we see the same kind of ray tracing delay, around 6 frames worth, but this time with shadows instead of reflection. It almost looks like the NPCs are leaving footprints in the snow as they walk, as the light hurries to fill the darkness left by the void their feet had caused, as there's no light source underneath their feet. And the shadow under them doesn't have any motion. It's not trying to follow the NPC as they walk. Instead, the shadow just kind of fades away, because the surrounding light is too soft to create a harsh shadow on that NPC. It's a really interesting consequence of having such accurate light recreation and an anomaly of lighting being processed in a 3D scene, but displayed out of sync with either the position of the in-game camera or the position of in-game objects. Now, things like this are absolutely going to get better with time, and we're certainly miles ahead of where we were when RTX effects first launched in late 2018 and early 2019. But it's interesting, now that we have the performance to actually enable things like real-time path tracing, what little anomalies of the rendering still exist that a lot of us likely haven't thought of. But the additional performance and RTX being actually a cool thing today is still only half of the story of this card. On stage at CES this year, Jensen Huang made some pretty incredible claims about the AI capabilities in gaming on the RTX 5000 series cards. With updates to DLSS to version 4, as well as a second generation frame generation engine, even if your GPU doesn't have the raw horsepower to run a game at 4K and 100 frames per second with all the ray tracing goodies enabled, these new cards have gotten remarkably good at faking it. And by the way, if you comment just like your wife, you are going to be immediately banned. I said the joke first, now you can't. First up, DLSS used to be so bad in the early days that I straight up couldn't stand having it enabled. I would rather suffer through 45 FPS in a shooter than get 65 FPS and deal with all of the visual wonkiness that I had on screen. But over the years, and especially with Nvidia's 4000 series GPUs, we've gotten to the point where unless you really know what you're looking for and you're pixel peeping an image, the average person is likely not going to notice any artifacting from DLSS at all. With DLSS 4 in Cyberpunk, I was only able to introduce noticeable issues in a single situation, and that's in a scene where we had vertical bars with a building in the background that had angled sides, and moving from left to right caused the angle to shift and skew ever so slightly from the rest of the image. Basically, the straight line on the building failed to be a straight line and kind of stair-stepped with the vertical bars that were in front of me. That's DLSS now at its worst, struggling to figure out what angle it should have drawn the texture at in relation to the rest of the scene. But honestly, that's such a nitpicky complaint and such a weird and niche and specific situation. DLSS probably isn't going to bother you at all by enabling it in-game. At this point in time, it's essentially free performance. I didn't spend a ton of times in other titles searching for DLSS issues, but if they were present, they also weren't invasive enough for me to even notice, even through nearly 40 hours of playing games on this card, including 24 hours straight of nothing but benchmarking. I'm sure I missed something, but to me, if it's not a big enough problem that I don't see it when staring at this card for a week straight, it's probably not a big enough issue that you're going to notice in daily use either. But probably the biggest news from this announcement is the release of Nvidia's FrameGen 2 for RTX 5000 series cards, a technology that Nvidia debuted with their 4000 series cards and has been the subject of controversy ever since. The idea behind this tech is pretty simple. Your card draws a frame, along with calculating the relevant ray tracing, and displays it on your monitor. It then draws a second frame and analyzes the difference between them to figure out the starting and final location of individual pixels or elements on the screen. It maps those elements and determines their direction and velocity as well as their importance in the scene, and can then essentially use AI image generation to fill in the gaps in between your frames. The first generation of this process could generate one AI frame in between every rendered frame, essentially doubling your displayed frame rate at little to no extra processing cost on your graphics card. But with the RTX 5000, the AI processing can now draw up to 3 frames for every rendered frame, up to quadrupling your perceived frame rate. But what's the catch? For the sake of keeping numbers simple, let's say 50 frames per second. Your GPU renders the first frame and displays it on screen. It then uses image generation along with the calculations it made for the movement of elements on screen to draw an additional 3 frames, keeping the motion of each element smooth throughout the process. It also paces out their delivery in line with the expected time of the next real rendered frame when it should be delivered. In the end, you jump from 50 frames per second on your monitor all the way up to 200 frames per second. Pretty sweet, right? The catch is that your game is still being rendered and processed at just 50 frames per second. Button presses will likely need to wait until the next real frame to render to be processed by the game engine, potentially leading to increased perceived latency. But Linus Tech Tips actually did some latency testing and found that there was actually no major hit from running FrameGen. With Nvidia Reflex disabled, that is Nvidia's anti-lag API, as well as Nvidia FrameGen disabled, Linus Tech Tips saw roughly 60 milliseconds of input latency in Cyberpunk 2077. With Reflex enabled and then running in fully native rendering mode, that number fell to just 30 milliseconds, responding twice as fast to player inputs. Enabling Nvidia FrameGen made basically no change to the input latency, with all of their numbers coming in with what I would consider to be a margin of error, and that's whether they were generating 1, 2, or 3 AI-generated frames in between real frames. For their full breakdown, I will have a link to their review down in the video description as well. As far as the effect of FrameGen on image quality, I've got to tell you, I don't see much at all. Again, if you're pixel peeping like a camera YouTuber searching for chromatic aberration, I'm sure you'll find some things worth talking about. But just running the games and playing them, outside of some potentially softer textures, there really wasn't much to talk about. It just kind of works. Now obviously, this is going to have some limitations, as the game is still running at 121 frames per second, not 477. Upcoming cards like the RTX 5070 or 5070 Ti also may not fare as well, especially given that they only have 1/3 of the raw CUDA cores and RT cores, and far less AI processing power to work with. But on the RTX 5090, FrameGen appears to be far more capable than just a cheap parlor trick. So there's lots of interesting tech to look at, and the performance capabilities to actually run it well are now finally capable. But what do I actually think of the Nvidia RTX 5090? As a piece of technology, it's hard not to be excited about what's possible here. Ray tracing and path tracing are finally in a state where they just flat out run great, and add to the visual storytelling in games rather than just being a gimmick and a drain on resources. DLSS has made massive strides over the last few years, and is equally in a state where I'd recommend turning it on in basically every title that it's available. And Nvidia FrameGen looks like it's ready for prime time in just its second generation of existence. But I also want to frame this review realistically. The RTX 5090 is a luxury product in a world of $6 dozen eggs and out-of-control rents, and I promise this is not a political statement. But things are beyond expensive right now for a ton of people. And while the RTX 5090 is the undisputed best graphics card that has ever been made, bar none, it's also a $2,000 supercar-esque piece of tech that only 1% will ever have the opportunity to drive. The people who are interested in the RTX 5090 likely have already pre-ordered it, and were going to buy it regardless of my video, because there was no doubt in anyone's mind that this would be the new high watermark when it comes to graphics performance. But I'm also concerned about what the RTX 5090 means for the world of gaming moving forward. With the previous two generations, Nvidia was pushing just about everyone toward their Halo product, whether it was the RTX 3090 or the RTX 4090 based on their prices. The RTX 3080 Ti was $1,200 for the Founders card and upwards of $1,400 for an AIB partner card. An RTX 3090 could be had for just $1,600 and seemed like a relative bargain to spring for at just $200 more. It's similar to the RTX 4080 Ti and the RTX 4090, again priced at $1,200 and $1,600 retail respectively. But now, there's a gap between the fastest card in the world, the RTX 5090 priced at $1,999, and the likely runner-up for that crown, the RTX 5080 coming in at just $999. The gap is not just in price point either, but also in performance, with the RTX 5080 being almost exactly half of an RTX 5090 in every major spec. It's half the CUDA cores, half the RT and Tensor Cores, therefore half of the AI capabilities, and half of the memory. That means the RTX 5080 will probably perform between 50 and 55% as well as the RTX 5090, and while the RTX 5090 posted benchmarks that finally make 4K ray-traced gaming a reality, the reality might not be so rosy this time next week when we start to see benchmarks for the RTX 5080. The RTX 5070 and 5070 Ti are also only around a month away, and have around 1/3 of the specs as seen here. Now, before I get into this, extrapolating one benchmark number to estimate another is far from an exact science. I was excited for path tracing on the RTX 5090 with 121 frames per second in Cyberpunk at 1440p and 112 FPS in Indiana Jones. But if the numbers wind up as expected, we're going to get native speeds of just 40 and 37 frames per second in those games. Speeds that might introduce more graphical and latency issues in DLSS and FrameGen than we see on the 5090. It's been over 20 years since we've been in a situation where there are new graphics cards for sale in stores that may not be able to properly play every game that's currently on the market. Indiana Jones will more than definitely run on an RTX 5070, but you're not going to get phenomenal looking path trace lighting, smooth shadows, and reflected natural light like we see on the 5090, which means Nvidia's vision of a ray-traced future may still only be a reality for the 1% that can play it on hardware that can actually support it. I don't mean to finish the video with doom and gloom, but that's a pretty wide gap to cover. Now, if you're a whale who hasn't yet ordered an RTX 5090 and you're thinking about doing that, I will have links on where to find one down in the video description, as well as links on where to find the rest of the hardware that I used in this video. If you like this kind of content and want to help support the channel, please consider joining the Patreon. Not only will you help keep the lights on around here, you'll also get exclusive access to my Discord server, where you can chat directly with me along with the other hosts from Talking Heads. I've also got some amazing merch over on craftcomputing.store. From laser-engraved nucleated pint glasses and coasters, all of it is designed and made in-house 100% by me. Go check it out now and show your support for the channel, and get some awesome swag while you're at it. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and I know it's a little bit different take on a GPU review. Let me know what you thought of it down in the video description. In the meantime, thank you all so much for watching this one, and as always, I will see you in the next video. Cheers, everyone. Beer for today is from Level Beer up in Portland, Oregon. It is the Pixelated Pale Northwest Pale Ale, clocking in at 6.1%. Punchy tropical fruit up front, rounded out by a modest bitterness and crisp malty finish, making pale ale cool again. So this is one of the longest reviews that I have ever written, and I have more than a pint. Cool, I have a little bit that I can review before I get back to the program as scheduled. This review was 12 pages single-spaced. This is one of the longest pieces of literature I have ever put to paper. And I hope you're enjoying it. I hope you enjoyed the video that I just shot. I often try to pair the beer with the subject matter, even loosely, tangentially, pair the beer. This is Level Beer, and they often do gaming-inspired beers, and I thought Pixelated Pale was perfect for DLSS upscaling. I just love the disparity of a poorly rendered beer, pixel art style. That's why I chose it. Level Beer is fantastic. I've drank their brewery a number of times. They've got some absolutely fantastic beers. This is one of them. 6%, just a straight-up pale ale. As they said, it's a little bit citrusy. It says it finishes a little malty. I kind of disagree with that. It just kind of fades out with like a little bit of like an orange rind kind of style to it. It's very orangey. It's very orange forward. It's a great beer to have a meal with. This is one of my favorites when I go up to the brewery, and I'll get an order of onion rings or something like that. Or they've got some phenomenal taco trucks right outside the brewery. Get a couple of tacos on a Tuesday and a really fantastic Northwest Pale Ale. It's not too hoppy. It's just the right amount of citrus. It's just dry enough that kind of makes you want more. I like this one a lot.